central to the Christian faith is the gospel. Pastor, the idea of the gospel seems so clear and evident, yet it's one of these things that we have to keep reminding ourselves what it is.
Interesting. You say we need to keep reminding ourselves what it is. I agree, because it is so unhuman, so otherworldly, that we need to keep reminding ourselves what is the gospel. We all know the gospel is encapsulated in John 3:16, perhaps the best known verse in the scripture. For God so loved the world that he did what?
He gave his
only son, that whosoever believes in him should not perish, but have eternal life. Also Romans 5:8 says, for God shows his love towards us, in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. So in essence, the gospel is the love of God demonstrated through the death of Jesus Christ on behalf of sinners.
Yes, and that's the core concept of it, Pastor. And it's funny that this word "give" is so central to that whole statement, to the whole idea of the gospel. The gospel can be almost summarized as giving of the highest form.
Yes, and what makes this giving of the highest form? Step back up. For God
so loved. So love makes that giving.
Yes.
Yeah.
So Jesus goes on to say, God didn't send his son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved. Demonstrating then that this love of God is for all human beings, for all his creatures that he has created. It is not partial. And this was revolutionary to Nicodemus, the guy he was speaking to, that God loved the whole world and didn't plan to condemn the whole world. Paul goes on to say something else. He says in Romans 1:16, I am not ashamed of the gospel of Jesus Christ, because it is the
power of God.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So this power of the gospel, where is it? Where is the power of the gospel? Well, the power of the gospel is in the love that drives it, which brings about the transformation.
Mm-hmm. And Pastor, maybe even right there, I mean, I feel like the part you're living there is also critical. The power of love that drives it to give. Because again, when we think about love in this romantic age, it's a feeling. But love, biblically speaking, leads you to action.
Always. It drives action. And even in this romantic age too, when you love your girlfriend, you don't forget her Valentine's Day. You want to buy her a lovely card. You buy a chocolate, take her to a restaurant. So love, even at the selfish, petty human level of romanticism, still leads to
giving.
Yeah. But what makes the gospel love different is that it is driven beyond feeling, whether there's feeling or not, to a sacrificial giving and to transformation. In other words, the true love of the gospel is a love that loves without judging. And that's the greatest gift that anyone can have. It's the greatest space for transformation that there can be, to be loved and not judged. That's beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah, and you see, even when talking the last episode about not just giving to those people who have position and power and privilege, we know that they have those things, so we want to give them because maybe there's some repayment, there's some reward, there's some something we will get in return at some point. But the gospel knows that you're poor.
Yes.
Accepts you as you are.
Blessed are the poor in spirit, yes.
Yeah. And then gives you
come if you're tired and weary, yes.
Yeah, gives you more than you deserve.
So that while we were yet sinners, you hear what Paul says. He says, for a good man, some might even dare to die. A good man will be someone who is kind and, that nice neighbor.
Yeah.
For a righteous man, perhaps he will die.
There's something there for you to sacrifice.
Yeah, but he said, but God shows his love in this. While we were still sinners, alienated from him, his enemies, he demonstrated that love.
And maybe even another way to phrase that is, while we were in a state which did not deserve to be given anything.
But definitely, your enemy doesn't deserve to receive anything from you but more condemnation.
Mm-hmm.
but more hate and anger. So he's saying even while we were enemies towards God, he showed himself to be a friend and gave. So that transformation that comes through the gospel is what Paul was talking about in Ephesians 2:8-10, where he says, for by grace
You have been saved.
through faith.
Mm-hmm.
And even that faith is not of your own. It is, again, that word gift of giving. God gives that faith.
Yes.
He said we were created unto good works. So we see then the gospel's power is in that transformation that comes through grace that leads me towards good works. And good works here, we're going to look at it further on, and not exactly what some of us are thinking about. So we're going to look further on at what it is. And then Paul says something that I still meditate on a lot. He says in Romans 6:14, sin shall have no dominion over you, because you are not under the law, but under grace. So again, showing that this grace that Paul talks about that saves us is also an antidote towards sin. And we shall see sin today in this podcast as beyond just these moral flaws, but an attitude of selfishness, greed, uncaring, prejudice, politics, and all that make life in this world so difficult.
And mean. And so it's interesting because when you place those two ideas on the opposite side, sin and grace is unmerited favor. Grace is abundance, more than enough.
What you don't deserve, as you rightly said, yes, more than enough. It is power to counteract this cancer with which we are all born. And if you think about it really, all the suffering in the world today comes down to sin. And people say, well, yes, sin is such a vague word, but yes, sin, that attitude. Remember, we're not talking about sins, the little acts we do here and there. These are the fruit of sin, that principle of greed, of selfishness, of I don't care about you, I will exploit you. Think about the fact that in this world today, most of the wealth is concentrated in such a small percentage of the world's population. Think about the fact that the same company that will sell you a pair of shoes for $100 will pay a worker in Indonesia or in Vietnam or these countries $2 for that same shoe, to make that shoe. Think about the fact that the CEO can make 150 times the salary of a mid-level management person in his company and think that is okay. And if things are difficult with the company, like they're not making as much money, do you think the CEO reduces his salary?
No.
He reduces the staff,
right,
the workers, so he can maintain. I even found it so audacious, Joel, that even while Enron was going under and that big insurance company that went under during the big financial bubble that burst in 2008, these guys were still giving themselves bonuses.
Lehman.
Yes, they were still giving themselves bonuses even though the company has floundered under their leadership. That is the fruit of sin, that selfishness and greed that produces all the suffering and pain. So the gospel becomes that grace, transforming grace, that is just the opposite of that. So I would like to say the gospel is the fruit of compassion. And it works the fruit of compassion in us. So God's compassion was the source of the gospel, which is Jesus Christ coming to die and all of that for us. And when we receive the gospel, it works that compassion in us so that now we can love our fellow man.
And it's a powerful way to even now start looking at this whole idea of giving, Pastor, because I think this is not even a matter of thinking. The way it is clearly being presented there, it's that God has done this massive act of giving His grace to us, as undeserving as we are.
Yes.
And in so giving to us, that giving should transform us to then make us able to give further on to the people around us.
I like your statement except for one word you used. Should. Why do you think I don't like the use of the word should in what you just said? Which was a beautiful statement. You say the gospel should lead us to.
I'm struggling to find why, because for me it makes sense that the power should compel us onward to actually then act and reciprocate.
You see, I guess what I'm trying to say, once you put the word should, you begin putting me under pressure to try to be something, that I have to do something. And this is part of the great problem with Christianity today, with the gospel that is preached and lived today, that people come to church and receive the gospel with a sense of, I need to do this, I should be doing this, or I should be doing that.
I see. Mm-hmm.
So there's a pressure. So Jesus said, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. The King James Version said, if you love me, keep my commandments. Do you see the difference in those two statements? That one word makes all the difference. In one version, the King James Version, which is a poor translation, it says, if you love me, keep my commandments. And it was like, order you, go out there and keep my commandments. You better do it. The real way to interpret the Greek there is, you will keep my commandment. It's a natural consequence. It flows naturally from the love that you have for me. So that is why when you said should, I say, once you put should, it kind of tells me I got to go out there and do.
So it creates a sort of manipulation within that whole understanding.
A type of legalism, a sort of righteousness by works.
I will appreciate that. And really, maybe I'm speaking past even in the very terms you're speaking, because the essence for me is that whenever somebody, even in our everyday interpersonal interactions, does something good to you, there's a sense to do something in return. Somebody, I think a while back you were saying, somebody sends you a gift, you're also waiting and saying, hey, when can I get a chance to also send them back?
Right. That's the natural legacy that we are born with. So the selfishness and greed and all of that, which is part of the sin problem in us, produces that legacy of, if you give me something, I have to give you back something as measurable. So if it's my birthday and you say, hey, it's pastor's birthday, let me send him a card with a nice gift in it. By the way, I hate empty cards. Okay. So, so you send me this lovely card with whatever it is in it. Maybe just a check for $200. I said, wow, Joel is nice. But guess what? I'm now under pressure because 2 months later, when it's your birthday, where things happening in my mind?
How do I raise this much money?
Yeah.
Or more
I can't send Joel an empty card after he sent me a card with $200. I can't even send him $100. I got to do something equal or above.
So you're saying the gospel does not do that or does more than that? I'm
saying because gospel doesn't go down that road at all. It gives disinterestedly. That is why Paul says in Romans 6, hear this. He says hear this, a free gift. Notice, a gift is usually free.
Mm-hmm. But it doubles down on that freeness of it.
Yeah, it's a free gift because most of us receive a gift and somewhere in the back of your mind and mine, because of
we're
this.
Thinking transactionally about.
I love that. Yes, transactionally. Okay, what do I give in return? Yeah. So for my birthday, my children promised to give me this gift. I say, where's my gift, for my birthday? So my daughter says, I hope you'll be as enthusiastic when it is my birthday to send me my gift. So, which put me under pressure. It put me under so much pressure. I stopped asking them
for your gift.
Because I don't want to be under that pressure because they have one father to put their money together to buy one gift for their one father. I have three of them. I guess what I'm saying, we think transactionally. That's our natural legacy. So the gospel counteracts all of that. And the first sign of the gospel being born in you and in me is compassion, especially towards the least of these.
Define for us compassion, Pastor, because I think it's one of those terms, again, even as we're talking about sin. Compassion also seems to be this word that can be taken in many ways. What does really compassion mean in this context of the gospel?
A tenderness towards those who are in need. tender desire to help those who are in need because I see the pain and suffering. I feel it. Come, meaning with, and passion, feeling. So I feel what they feel. And because I'm not actually suffering what they suffer, it's vicariously I'm feeling this. I am moved to alleviate their suffering. Just as if I was in their place, I would do what? Be moved to alleviate my own suffering. So if I'm hungry, what would I do if I'm hungry?
I'll look for food.
Yes, because I need to satisfy this hunger within me. So if I have compassion on someone who is hungry, it means I can identify with that hunger and feel it vicariously. And so I am moved now to satisfy his hunger in the same measure I would have been moved to
satisfy my own.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So when we talk about compassion, we are talking about that tender feeling of identification with those who are in need that moves me. Hear that word, that moves me to want to alleviate that situation.
To act with kindness towards them.
Yes.
Yeah, which I think is an important way then now to see how Jesus moves towards us results in us moving that way to others.
Yes, that is why in certain situations it says, and being moved with compassion, Jesus fed them the loaves of bread. Moved with compassion, he healed your sicknesses. Moved with compassion. Compassion drives you to want to alleviate the pain or the suffering. Which tells me then, Joel, compassion is not a rule, it's not a command, it's a thermometer or it's a gauge of our transformation. You're still with me, right?
Mm-hmm.
Compassion in you and me becomes that gauge, that testing of our transformation into children of God. Much compassion, much love. Little compassion, little love. So Jesus says the greatest commandment is to love God. And then the other commandment, he says, is to do what? Love your fellow man. So Jesus said everything in the prophets, everything you read, every rule of God, every commandment, every requirement of God comes down to this. Love me, God, of course, and then love
your neighbor.
Your neighbor. Love your fellow man. That is why he gave the parable of the Good Samaritan, to show the God spirit. So then he's saying, if you truly are transformed, like the rich young ruler, Master, I want to follow you, Master. I want to be with you, He just says, great. What can I do? He says, sell all that you have. It isn't that Jesus wanted him to sell everything. It was Jesus making him aware that he lacked compassion.
Or that his claims were not consistent with his deepest beliefs.
Well, that would be beautiful. So in other words, compassion would be the test, the evidence of this other thing here.
Yes.
So he comes, I want to be saved. I want to follow you, Jesus. I've followed you all my life. All these things I've done. Jesus said, okay, well then, sell what you have. Because
that will truly test what you're saying.
Yes, your commitment to me, your commitment to my way, your love for me, because it is impossible to be with me, to be in me, to have my grace in you and not have compassion towards others. Which brings us to why Jesus said to those who are lost, the goats, he said, depart from me. They said, why? We don't understand this. He said, because I was sick, I was hungry, you know that. He said, he didn't help me. But Jesus, how could you say that? Because you didn't do it
to the least of this.
In other words, there was no compassion in your life. With all your religious service, it lacked compassion, which is that tender identification with those who suffer that moves me to want to alleviate their pain and suffering. Just as if I was feeling it in my own self, I would be moved to alleviate that pain or that suffering.
So, Pastor, we start out by talking about the gospel. And for many of us, we say we have accepted and received the gospel, and we are committed to the gospel.
Mm.
The case that now you're making then is the test of these commitments, of these claims we make about the gospel, are really in how we interact with the least of this.
Definitely. It is, Jesus said it in Matthew chapter 5. He says, Hey, even the Gentiles love those
Who love them.
who love them. He said, so what are you doing more than these if you love those who love you and you treat those who treat you nice, you treat them nice? He said, that's, even the Gentiles do this. He said, but if you really want to be a child of your Father, you got to love your enemies. He said, because God sends his rain on the just and the unjust. So he says, if you're truly a child of your Father, you will be loving your enemies. He said, be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. And this perfection Jesus is speaking about in Matthew 5:48 is the perfect love of God that moves him with compassion to love the unlovable, to give his son to die, to send his rain on the just and the unjust, to sacrifice himself on behalf of others. So our perfection is not judged, Joel, by not quote unquote sinning, by keeping the Sabbath, by not smoking or drinking, by not committing adultery. All of these things are good and needful, but our perfection is really judged by the compassion we have, not for those who are like us, who are belong to our group, who can pay me back, but by the least of these, that poor person, that suffering person who has nothing to offer me except his gratitude and his thanks. So what I'm saying is, love brings good deeds out of us. Legalism forces us to try to be good, to do good deeds.
And so, for a believer, how do you differentiate in your life if you are being legalistic versus you being loving?
And
Because-
that's a very viable question. I think it's a great question. In other words, how should I put it? Which comes first to your mind, Joel? You don't have to answer this, just in case it might be embarrassing, the answer. But which comes first when you are helping someone? Is it, I need to help this person and maybe they will be baptized, they'll come to church. I need to do this because God requires me to do this. Or, this person needs help and I want to help him. You see that spontaneous working in your mind when confronted with having to do good? That is what tells us.
So the motivation really tells a lot about what is driving you to act in a loving way, so to say.
Yes. In other words, this is a good question we all have to ask ourselves. I ask myself this question too. Do I have to push myself to help others? And I only help those who either belong to my group, who are like me, or those who I hope by helping them
Will become like me.
they will join my church, they will come to church, they will do all these things. If I have to push myself to do good, if when I see a guy begging at the side of the street, my first impulse is not to help, but then I have to stop myself and say, no, what would Jesus do? I am deficient in compassion and love. So that is what I'm saying, compassion, that feeling that just comes up in you when you see suffering, and that desire to help is a test. It's like a litmus test. It's like a gauge of where I am in my gospel growth. How much am I like Christ? It is not measured by how much good I do per se. It is my closest to God, my growth in the gospel is not measured by the acts of religious service, even by the good I do. Because when I do good, I do it because it makes me feel God will love me more. I'm in good favor with God. If it makes me feel better than the other person, if it makes me feel more blessed, look at God has blessed me that I can help this person. I thank God that, I have my job and he has been so good to me. If when I do good, something in me says, this is gaining me points in heaven's ledgers, I have found in myself the revelation that I have still to be embraced and covered and imbued by the gospel, because the gospel produces compassion. That love of God to me, that love that transforms me into a loving, kind, compassionate person. And that is what John says in 1 John 3, 16 and 17. Perhaps you could read that for me, Joel. 1 John 3, 16 and 17. I think it's a great reminder.
That reads, by this we know we love, because he laid down his life for us. And we also ought to lay down our lives for the brethren. But whoever has the world's goods and sees his brother in need and shuts up his heart from him, how does the love of God abide in him?
You see, he says, if you could shut up your heart from those you see, your brother, which could be any other human being, he said, how can you say God's love abides in you? So basically, let's sort of repeat myself because it's meaningful for us to really bear this in mind. The measure of our love is demonstrated by our compassion and action. Compassion and action towards the least of these. Those different from us, those unable to help us, those who don't belong to our group, those who have nothing to give us in return. Disinterestedly helping others, where I hope to get nothing in return. That is the ultimate demonstration of godlike compassion. But not only that, even the early church, as we mentioned in our last podcast, failed here. Do you know, Joel, that at the beginning of the early church, they only preached to Jews? They only preached to Jews. In other words, it was still about us and our group. Even in the distribution of the food, remember we read about it, the Judean Jews apparently were not really giving towards the Hellenistic Jews their rightful amount. So there's this big split between the Hellenistic Jews, those who belong to the other parts of the Roman Empire, and the Judean Jews, those who came from the motherland, so to speak, Jerusalem. Because again, that natural human legacy of selfishness, of clannishness, of my side versus your side, was still clawing its way even in the early church, where the Holy Spirit was driving them to be kind and generous. And that is what we see in church politics. That's what we see in our national politics. So we as human beings need to recognize, as Paul says in Galatians, they're neither Jew nor Gentile. Galatians 3:28. He said that in God there's no Jew nor Gentile, no Greek nor Roman, no male nor female. What he's saying is, in Christ we recognize our common humanity. So tell me, Joel, what do you think I mean when I say we recognize our common humanity?
We realize how we all share the same level of value that has been extended to us by God.
Put a little more meat on that bone.
We all recognize that we face the same situation, we face the same realities.
True. But even when we recognize that, sometimes we still feel, well, if I'm black, whites are not like me. Mm-hmm. Even though the whites still need to eat and drink and everything, but somehow I see that their needs are not like my needs, or the Muslims don't understand me in the West. So common humanity would simply mean, number one, we are all children of God, even if we don't always acknowledge it, we don't always act like it. Two, we all bleed, whether I'm white, black, Jewish, whatever, we all have type A, B, or O blood. We all need to be loved, to love. So my common humanity says, today it's me, today it's you, sorry, tomorrow it's me. You might be the one who just lost your home from a fire. But guess what? It could have been
me,
my home. Mm-hmm. Just today, a friend of mine told me she was robbed. She got into her car and put her bag on the back seat, and then went in the front seat to drive and two young men who she saw, and hi mom, passed her by, recognized a single lady. So when she put the bag in the back of her car and just opened it, snatched her handbag and ran with it, with her credit cards, her identification, her driver's license, money, everything. Robbed in a moment notice. Somebody told me their house burned down. They went to church actually. And while they were in church, their house burned down. The point is, our common humanity means we all have the same basic needs. We suffer from the same fears and anxieties. And though our religion might be different, our race might be different, our culture might be different, our basic human needs are the same. And while today I may be living well, today I may have a job, today I may be living in America where we don't have tsunamis and we don't have typhoons and we don't suffer some of these things, and those people in India and in Sri Lanka and other places do, guess what? In California there are earthquakes. There are floods that come our way sometimes. There are twisters. Today it's you, tomorrow it could be me. Compassion says, I am not suffering what you are suffering now, but I could identify with it, and vicariously I feel it. And I'm moved to help you, just as I would be moved to help myself if I was in that situation. So basically what we're saying, as we kind of wind down, is that the Great Commission to preach the gospel into all the world, the great everlasting gospel that the angels preach in Revelation 14, 6 and 7, that talks about God's judgment and to worship the Creator, is not about fear and trembling. It's about hope. Because for God, judgment means justice too, and equality. And why? Because if the evildoer is oppressing me, that's an imbalance. So justice that clamps down the evildoer allows me to rise up and take my place that I should have. So justice in God's eyes is really an evening of the balance, leveling off of the scale, bringing justice and fairness. Judgment for God is about restoring that which was lost. So this final generation of Christians, given this task to preach the gospel, is really preaching a message of mercy, of a God who created this world in love, who created a world to be happy and enjoyed by all. A God who is saddened by the conditions that exist, who has the intention of changing things, of bringing things back to the original plan. So it's a great message to have to preach this everlasting gospel. Not of a hellfire and of an angry God, but of a God of compassion who says, I want to restore things. Like Paul says in Romans 8:20, that even the creation groans. In Romans 8:20-20, he said, even the creation groans to be delivered. It means that hurricanes and floods and that destroy acres, fires that destroy lands and stuff, Paul pictures the creationists of groaning. We want, again, a world in which only beauty flourishes. There are no more death and pain. So now, let's ask ourselves these questions. Do we recognize our common humanity to all people? Do we feel compassion when we see those who suffer? Again, that question, which comes first to our thoughts when we help someone? I'm helping him so he will accept the gospel. When I come by to invite him to a crusade or evangelism, he will join my church. Or do we just help because we can help? Can we help just for helping others? Just because I hate to see my brother in that condition. Whether he accepts the gospel or not is irrelevant, because actually I am showing the gospel. And maybe as I help him, the Lord will be able to use my kindness to awaken in him a desire to hear what I have to say. Do we have to push ourselves to help others? And are we doing good based on a sense that it will somehow make us better in God's sight? These are questions that we need to ask ourselves. And again, dear listener, don't beat up on yourself if you realize that you are low on compassion. All it means is you have not grown enough yet. You need to expose yourself more to God's grace. Hang out more with compassionate people and giving people. Choose to be intentional about your giving and about helping others. And pray for that transforming grace of the gospel. Because when the gospel takes hold of us, we will become compassionate. Because remember that the gospel is the fruit of compassion and works the fruit of compassion in us.
Thank you for journeying with us through this season and even for listening to this episode. Let Us Go Deeper is an independent ministry, and your contribution are essential to sustaining this journey. Please make any contributions you may to patreon.com/LUGD. That is patreon.com/LUGD.
And if this is your first time, please subscribe. And if you're one of our regular listeners, share the link. Invite your friends to listen in, and they too can be blessed by this podcast. Let us go deeper.